I'd like to welcome all of you to the next part of our program, which is the first public presentation of the Pisa 2022 Creative Minds, Creative Schools. We're going to start that with an address from the OECD Secretary General, Matthias Cormann, and then we'll have the full presentation from Andreas Schleicher.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all, a very warm welcome to this launch of the 2022 results for the OECD's flagship program for international student assessment. In December last year, we launched the first 2 volumes of Pisa. Volume 1 analyzed students' knowledge and skills in reading, mathematics and science, and how the COVID pandemic has affected student performance and well-being. And Volume 2 identified common features of high-performing systems. In this, the 3rd volume of Pisa, the creative thinking competencies of students were assessed for the first time ever in 64 countries and economies. This innovative assessment measures the capacity of students to generate, to evaluate, and to improve ideas in 4 different areas: creative writing, visual expression, scientific problem solving, and social problem solving. Equipping our younger generations with the right skills when it comes to creativity, innovation, and digital technology adoption will be a key to help address the impacts and to seize all of the opportunities when it comes to the ongoing transformations, in particular the impact of population aging, lagging productivity growth, of course to the green and digital transformations and the rapid development of artificial intelligence related opportunities. Recent studies show how the adoption of new and emerging technologies is already increasing the demand for soft skills in labour markets. The 2023 World Economic Forum survey, Future of Jobs, identified analytical thinking and creative thinking as the most important skills for workers. The results from the OECD's AI surveys of employers and workers highlighted the importance of communication and creativity skills as well, with 58% of employers in manufacturing, for example, saying that AI had increased the importance of these skills. This volume of Pisa provides insights into students' proficiency in creative thinking as well as the relationship with other areas measured. The results show that, on average, across the OECD, around half of our students could think of original and diverse solutions for simple expressive tasks and familiar problems, such as coming up with an interesting story idea or thinking of different ways to conduct an awareness-raising campaign in their school. However, around 1 in 5 students across OECD countries and more than half of students in the 20 low-performing countries and economies struggle with less challenging tasks, such as imagining a dialogue between 2 characters or reducing traffic in a city. And very few could suggest original or diverse ideas in creative expression tasks. The results also show that education systems that scored highly in creative thinking almost always performed highly in mathematics, reading, and science. This was the case of Singapore, Korea, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Estonia, and Finland, all of which are the highest performing systems in creative thinking. Other countries performed better in creative thinking than other Pisa topics. For example, Portugal is the only country that performed above the OECD average in creative thinking while being on par with the OECD average in all 3 Pisa core domains of mathematics, reading and science. And some Pisa 2022 top performers in mathematics, reading and science did less well in the assessment of creative thinking. This was the case of Czechia, Hong Kong, Macau, and Chinese Taipei. Findings in Pisa Volume 3 also confirm that girls outperformed boys in creative thinking in almost all countries with available data. In no country or economy with available data do boys outperform girls in creative thinking. The gender gap is significant in all countries, even when comparing boys and girls with similar mathematics performance in Pisa 2022, and in around half of all countries, even after accounting for students' reading performance, where girls traditionally do better than boys in Pisa tests. For effective education systems, it will be important to further help students develop their creative thinking skills, including by developing creativity supportive curricula with clear guidance for teaching and practices. Out of 37 of the PISA participating countries for which we have system-level information on creativity policies, 30 have integrated creativity into their curricula or learning standards, including through some practical courses like Korea and Denmark, or as interdisciplinary modules in Finland, Singapore, and New Zealand. But embedding creativity in curricula is not enough in and of itself. Some jurisdictions have developed detailed guidance and learning progressions or rubrics to help educators understand the outcomes to be expected and students' learning trajectories. Students with teachers who encouraged imagination and critical thinking in their classroom demonstrated more positive outcomes in creative thinking. Across OECD countries, between 60 and 70% of students report that their teachers value their creativity and that they're encouraged to come up with original answers, with relatively higher shares in Latin American countries and lower shares in European countries. We need to focus on addressing students' basic literacy skills to help close socio-economic divides. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds score significantly lower by 10 points than advantaged students when it comes to creative thinking. These results are also observed across domains in previous PISA tests. Disadvantaged students struggled the most in tasks that required written expression and long answers. And when compared to students with the same mathematics and reading abilities as measured by PISA 2022, the socio-economic gaps narrow, but nevertheless, they do persist. Many students in challenging environments deal with issues like food insecurity, housing instability, and significant family responsibilities, which consume their time and energy, leaving less space for creative pursuits. In addition, teachers in under-resourced schools may prioritize testing and basic skills to boost academic performance, unintentionally sidelining creative activities and practices, especially those that require writing skills. Third, encouraging accountability through monitoring and evaluation. Very few education systems assess creative thinking in a structured manner, with notable exceptions found in Australia. The Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority has developed a critical and creative thinking learning continuum to map progression in creative thinking according to different levels of proficiency. In the state of Victoria in Australia, the Curriculum and Assessment Authority has administered critical and creative thinking assessments annually to a sample of schools, including with a target of 25% or more Year 10 students, to have developed excellent critical and creative thinking skills. Monitoring and evaluation of creative thinking will be important to track progress and to identify areas of further improvement. This novel PISA assessment, we believe, provides a good and important starting point for education systems to build upon all of that. So in closing, creativity will help students and young people reach their full potential in our transforming economies and societies as future innovators, entrepreneurs and policymakers, among others. This PISA 2022 Volume 3 and the results and findings and recommendations in this report provide governments with additional actionable data in support of skills-based learning for resilient and future-oriented education systems. My very best wishes for a positive and productive conference, and thank you for having given me the opportunity to say a few words.
Having heard from the Secretary General, I'd now like to turn the floor over to Andreas Schleicher from the OECD's Directorate for Skills, Education and Skills. Before doing so, just mention to those watching us online, the journalists, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to some of those after Andreas's presentation.
Thank you so much, and it gives me a real pleasure to share some of the findings in greater detail with you that we published today. Creativity is nothing new, and actually, if you ask most people in education, they would, acknowledge its importance. We looked at this across subject areas, and in most countries, actually, most subject areas in the curricula, specify something around creativity. So, and it's not just, the visual arts. You can see here, it's basically everything. You can even see in physical education, citizenship education, history. Everywhere we acknowledge creativity. But when we ask 10 and 15-year-olds about their creativity, we found in almost every jurisdiction that 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say, well, that's impossible. In school, students always learn something. But, maybe not. Maybe there are areas where actually our schools take something away from learners. I know that developmental psychologists have lots of explanations for those kinds of numbers. They say, well, when we grow older, we become more self-critical, more, more skeptical about lots of things. And it may be true, but you can see also those effects are quite different across different jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, we see a steep drop of creativity, and others less so. And we're all born with an abundance of creativity. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question anything you tell them. They're going to experiment with everything you put into their hands. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn and relearn. But then we put them into schools. We try to make them compliant with our ways of thinking. We teach them answers rather than questions. And then we see those data. I'm a scientist by background, and often it breaks my heart how we teach, science like religion. We make people believe in some scientific theory, then we give them lots of exercises to practice this, and at the end we test whether they remember the answers we taught them. Well, that has nothing to do with science. Science is about inquiry. Science is not about reproducing the wisdom of our times, but to question it. But then we see those data. Now, so we ask countries, what stands in the way? Why don't we do better on this? And number one is curricula too crowded. We teach too many things. Now we push everything into the learning environment, and then, the curricula become a mile wide but an inch deep. Now lots of things taught at very shallow depths, no space for creativity. Or, lack of assessment. That's also a really powerful message. Now, we do not look at creativity, and therefore nobody cares. As always, what you look at, you cannot improve what you cannot see. You will not change what you do not measure. So that's really interesting that most countries acknowledge this. And then, of course, lack of capacity. That's the easier part to understand. It's probably much harder to teach creativity than to teach formulas and equations. So I think there are some understandable factors in this. But there are clear barriers. And that really brought us to look into this in greater detail in our Pisa tests. And we have a pretty broad knowledge base in the whole of the Pisa. Not everyone took this creativity test, creative thinking test, but most education systems did. So we have a really good kind of understanding of where the world comes out on that. We looked at the capacity of young people to imagine, to generate new ideas, divergent ideas. That was a very, very important part of creative thinking. We looked at the extent to which they could also come up with different solutions, generate diverse ideas. And then, are they able to assess the originality of their thinking? And we looked at that in different contexts, from scientific problem solving to social problem solving, visual expression, written expression. So it's actually quite a rich, set of assessment instruments that we were able to deploy for this assessment. But I know you want to see the results, so here they are. Now you can see at the top and in green the countries that came up above the OECD average, then blue is around the average, and then in pink is the countries performing below the average. So that's how countries come out. At first sight, you might say, well, that doesn't look so different from Pisa. Now, Singapore always comes out on top, and you can see that here as well. But, when you look a little bit longer in this, you see some really interesting exceptions. Now, it is not, that we can predict creative results quite easily from what students achieve in mathematics and reading. I show you this in a little bit more detail. Here, basically, you don't see the absolute performance, but you see the relative performance to what we predict from mathematics result. So if the bars go up, it means countries do better than what you predict from the performance of students in creativity. You can see, for example, Chile, or Mexico, or Australia. They do better in creative thinking than what you would predict from their mathematics performance. And you have countries on the right side that do not come out as well as what you would expect. What is very interesting is that some of the East Asian countries that always come out on top on mathematics and science, you can see on the left side there are some who do better than predicted. Look at Singapore, look at Korea. They do well on mathematics, actually really well on mathematics, and they do still better on creative thinking. Because these are education systems that have put a lot of emphasis on this over the last decade, while the rest of the world was sleeping. We still believe often, in Europe, this is all rote learning countries. It is not. They have actually transformed their education systems, and as you can see, very successfully so. But other countries from East Asia, they do still maybe quite well on this test, but not as well as you would predict. So it's no longer that you can say East or West or so. There are actually education systems that have put an emphasis on creative thinking that come out well and others not so well. The relative performance is as interesting as the absolute performance on that. And it's the first time that we can see that. Now, this is, I think, what is really interesting. And, when you map that in a little bit more detail, you can see countries that do slightly better than predicted by math and reading. These are Denmark, Estonia, Israel, Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Spain, UAE. And then you see countries that do a lot better than what you predict. These are Australia, Canada, Finland, and New Zealand. And then you have some that do better than what you predict from reading. Belgium, Korea, Latvia, and Singapore, and some who do better than what you predict from math. It's Chile, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, and then Uruguay. So these are sort of the exceptions to the pattern. Still, cognitive performance is still a really good predictor for doing well on creativity. And that's, I think, no surprise. If you want to be creative, you have to know something. You have to be able to think for yourself. So those are skills that we develop, in subject areas. But then there is this additional extra, of having that space to generate your new ideas, to look at the originality of your ideas, and that's, I think, really, really important. Like for anything that you do in school, social background plays a role. Now, that's one of the biggest challenges education faces. Now, we have done quite well in the history of education in closing gender gaps. Now, if you look at math and science, there's no longer, very large gender gaps. But we have not seen much progress around the world in closing socioeconomic gaps. That is, I think, the bitter reality that the picture that we have today is pretty much the same that we had 20 years ago. But what is interesting, when you look at the impact of social background on early learning outcomes for creative thinking, you compare that with what you get for subject skills like mathematics, you can see actually that impact is somewhat smaller on creative thinking, and that should make us optimistic. Maybe it is easier for education systems to break through these kind of social barriers in fields like creativity than it is in mathematics. And maybe there is something in learning environment or something happening outside of schooling that supports the development of creative skills among disadvantaged students. So in most countries, we see that there is actually a marked difference in the strength of the impact that social background has on learning outcomes. And that, I think, is something that should give us time for reflection. I think this is a really interesting area for research to study in greater detail. The other part, in our Secretary General already mentioned that, is gender. Now, you can see basically in every country the bars go downwards, showing that girls do better on creative thinking than boys. And in some countries a lot, you know. Remember, you know, one of the highlights in Pisa in the early days was Finland actually comes out with the largest kind of gender gap. You know, Jordan, Finland, Palestinian Authority, Saudi Arabia, there are huge kind of gender gaps in favor of girls. And now you could say, well, you know, girls are also better readers. And, you know, reading is, again, you know, one of the ingredients to being creative. So maybe it's not so surprising. But even if you discount for that, and that's the interesting part of the story, no? even if you discount for that and look at gender differences in relative terms, you can see even in reading that gender gap is bigger in creative thinking than what you would predict from reading. No? It's true for mathematics, there the gender gap is not so large, but it's even true for reading. So there is something, you know, that makes girls more creative thinkers than boys. And actually the report, volume 3, gives a lot of clues for that. A lot of that has to do not just with, you know, cognitive abilities, but with attitudes and aspirations. I'm going to go through some of those factors in a moment, but just keep in mind, you know, on the socioeconomic side, we can see less of a gap than what we see in math and reading. On the gender gap, actually, it is larger than what we see. And that is something, again, you know, being aware is always the best starting point to address it. Now, public policy can only deal with things, teachers can only deal with things that they can see, and now we have tools and instruments actually to make those things visible. Now, last point I want to make on this is variability in performance. Now, the length of the bar here shows you the performance variability and creativity between schools. Now, when the bar is long, there's a big gap in school performance. Now, some schools are very creative, other schools are less so. When the bars are small, it means there is not much variation between schools. Now. And you can see, for example, here Estonia, you know, high-performing education system, and you can see very little of a gap between school. Every school is a creative school now. You can see on the other side of the spectrum some schools that may do well on average, but still, you know, it depends very much on the school where you put your child. No? So between school variability is another really important variable for policy. What you want to make sure is that, you know, the closest school is always the best school. No? That's the idea of public policy. Ensure, you know, that everybody has access to a great school. And you can see in some countries, they're pretty close to that. In other countries, there's a lot of variability. No? But that's what we see. You know, we do school league tables, school comparisons. It's actually quite familiar for people to look at school performance. What is often under the waterline is this, and that is the large variability that we see within schools. And that is even true in some countries that are doing really well in moderating school performance. Now you can see actually there's still a lot of variation within school. And sometimes underperformance is not just about, you know, poor schools in poor neighborhoods, but about, you know, many students from many neighborhoods doing actually not so well. And that variability is much harder to address policy-wise. Because if you see an underperforming school, you can say, okay, look, let's do something about it. But underperforming students within schools are much harder to detect, much harder to intervene. You need to have a much better diagnostics about that. And I think that is something that in creative thinking is as big an issue as it is in other subject areas. So that performance variation that we see within the school system. This is also something, you know, that we try to look in quite some detail. How does the distribution in creativity map against the distribution in, for example, mathematics? Are top performers in mathematics always top performers in creative thinking? And actually, it turns out It's not so clear. You know, when you look actually at the top performers in creative thinking, you can say, yeah, some are also top performers in mathematics, but, you know, some are not. And actually, some come out in the bottom of mathematics, and vice versa. So it doesn't map directly. On the other hand, it's encouraging. It means that, you know, sometimes, you know, you can be really, really creative without being so great in mathematics. If you look at the, you know, fourth quintile, you can see similarly, you know, it goes actually in different directions here. Some are doing well, some are not so well. But, you know, when you drill down, when you get to the lower end, you see actually when you are in the second quintile, your chance to be a top performer in mathematics gets very, very low. And I think that highlights a message that we come out often in Pisa, and that is if you do not get up to level 2, if you lack those foundation skills, you have very little of a chance to be doing well in anything. And I know Rick Hanushek is here with us. He's done an amazing analysis, you know, looking at, you know, what the economic impact would be of getting everybody at least to that level 2 threshold on Pisa. Now, that is the threshold in reading, you know, when you turn from, you know, a sort of deciphering text to actually using reading for learning. In mathematics, from, you know, simple number things to actually starting to think like a mathematician and so on. And students who do not make that threshold have very little of a chance to be creative. And, you know, or move or to vice versa. And when you get into the bottom quintile, you can see it's becoming almost impossible to end up as a top performer. So foundation skills are really, really important. Students need to have a solid foundation in the different areas in order to come out well on the creative path as well. And I think this is a really, really important start. Now, but I wanted to turn to some of the predictors. You know, what explains performance variation in creative thinking. And we looked at, you know, the beliefs students have about creativity, you know, the nature of creativity, where does it come from, the growth mindset. Now, do I believe that, you know, creativity is all about the intelligence I was born with, or, you know, does it relate to the effort I make? You know, can I grow beyond my limits? Now, we looked at attitudes, the creative self-efficacy, the openness to new ideas. We looked at the openness to art and experience and imagination and adventurousness. To what extent are young people, you know, going out and trying things and things like this? We looked at social emotional characteristics, you know, curiosity, persistence, taking different perspectives, assertiveness, cooperation, stress resistance, emotional control, and we looked at what do young people expect about their own future in terms of occupational terms and educational terms. And so those were some of the things that we measured, and it's the first time we put them into the public domain. Some of this actually came out from Pisa in December. We had, you know, thought of publishing it then, but it now comes out in this volume, and I think some really, really interesting data. Let's have a look at some of this, you know. Let's start with the nature of creativity, and you can see, for example, in Portugal, students believe that it is possible to be creative in every subject. You know, and that mindset that, you know, whatever I study can make me creative may be one of the reasons that, you know, helps them to do well. Now, if you do not believe that, you know, you can be creative in a subject, probably you're not going to be that. And you can see it varies across countries. Now, I think these are things that actually do vary across countries, and not just as, you know, predicted by cultural pattern. No? The growth mindset. No? Country like Brazil, you know, still struggles in education, but you have a very strong share of young people actually believing, you know, that creativity is something, you know, that is in their own control. And that growth mindset is actually a powerful predictor for performance with other things. At the same time, you know, I highlight here also the difference between advantage and disadvantage. Now, what you can see in Brazil and many countries is that it's much easier to have a growth mindset if you come from a wealthy family. No? Because probably that family gives you that message every day, you know, you're going to be successful. You try hard, you get, you know, what you're looking for. And if you come from a disadvantaged background, maybe that is harder for young people to experience, you know, that success. But again, you know, you see a lot of variability in outcomes. And those outcomes are actually quite predictive for what we see on the creative scale. Now, let's look at, you know, the attitudes towards creative thinking, you know, creative self-efficacy, openness to intellect, openness to art and experience. I just show you a couple of ones which I thought were really interesting. First of all, Here we look at the mean index across countries on self-efficacy. No? That's self-related beliefs. To what extent, do I believe in my own abilities in this? And you can actually, again, see quite quite big differences across countries on that kind of index. And then imagination and adventurousness. To what extent am I going to, go out and try things and do things? And also there, you can see actually that these things are quite different. And once again, they're powerful predictors of the results that we see on the test. Here, openness to intellect, openness to art and experience. And interesting, some of the countries here, look at Norway, look at the Netherlands, look at Germany, look at Denmark, Belgium, France. Not so pronounced. Those countries probably also, aspire to those kinds of outcomes. But when you ask students themselves, it doesn't seem that, that openness to new ideas, that openness to new experience is so prevalent in their daily experiences. So once again, food for thought for research, food for thought for educators, food for thought for public policy. Or here, and yeah, let's have a look at the differences make. Basically here I look at the impact those different factors have on outcomes, and you can see imagination and adventurousness. Often I get lost in, thought, coming up with new ideas is satisfying to me. You can see actually where students have those kinds of beliefs, you can see actually they tend to do better on the test. Openness to intellect, same kind of story. Openness to art and experience. I see beauty in everyday things. I enjoy artistic activities. I reflect on movies I watch and so on. Creative, self-efficacy. I can be creative. I can tell creative stories. I can think of many ideas, solving disagreements with people. Once again, where students have those kinds of attitudes, you can see consistently that they do better on the test for creative thinking. And for some of those variables, actually, the gender differences also explain some of those outcomes that we saw. Let me turn to social emotional characteristics, curiosity, persistence, perspective taking, assertiveness, stress resistance, emotional control, things like this. And here you can see just the example of curiosity. And in some countries, you look at Costa Rica here at the high end of the spectrum, at Ukraine at the low end of the spectrum. Again, the attitudes that young people have to being curious can be different across different education systems. When you look at persistence, another really important kind of outcome, you can see Peru coming at Finland and Norway coming at the low end. And that's another, at work and life, keep trying, being persistent is actually a good predictor for being successful. And it's also actually interestingly a good predictor for being creative, persistence in your ideas. Being able to taking perspectives. And this, by the way, is an area where girls do a lot better than boys. Being able to see the world through different lenses and perspectives, appreciate, different sides of the argument. So that's easier for girls, or more prevalent among girls. And again, a good predictor for creative thinking. So that helps explain, together with other things, some of the gender differences that we observed on the test. Now you can see big differences. You can see here Portugal coming out on top, Indonesia at the bottom. But then you look at collaboration, where Indonesia comes out on top. Now, that's something that is very familiar to students in Indonesia, very common in their kind of learning experiences. And you have here a high performer, Macau, coming very much at the end of the spectrum. So it's interesting to see how different countries come out. It's not always the same countries on the same spectrum, but countries have clearly different kind of strengths and weaknesses on those kinds of predictors and variables. Assertiveness, again, big differences across countries. And then stress resistance, can you manage yourself? Can you manage your emotions? And also there you can see Irish students seem to be very, very good at that. Students in Turkey have greater difficulties with this, according to their own reports on that. let's see how this plays out. And what you can see very clearly is the capacity to see the world through different lenses, appreciate different ways of thinking, see, multiple sides of an argument, something where girls are doing well, one of the strongest predictors of creative thinking. Curiosity, I like to know how things work. I'm curious about many different things. Very big predictor, persistence, stress resistance, assertiveness, social skills, and emotional control. All are really important ingredients or predictors for the outcomes on the creative thinking test. We do not know much about cause and effect. The causal nature of those relationships is something that requires other methods of research. But what you can see here is that the two somehow tend to go together. What we also found interesting, in some countries we have data from parents as well, and you can see actually parent and student data are pretty closely aligned. Now, where parents believe that it's possible to be creative in many subjects, you can see there are also more students taking those kinds of beliefs. So we don't again know who influences whom, but it seems there's something in the kind of ecosystem that may be more conducive to creative thinking for students in certain contexts and situations. Let me get to the last aspect, and that's what students think about their own future. The first is perhaps not surprising. The higher the educational aspirations of students, the better they do on creative thinking, and that's also what you see in academic performance. It's not surprising. People who do better on a test probably have higher educational aspirations. I think that's something pretty consistent that we see. Let's look at some of the school and classroom policies. I just picked, a couple that I thought, might be interesting for you. First of all, on the school climate and creativity. Now, one of the things that we see is when we ask students and school principals on growth mindset, on creativity, you can see actually also there, among school principals, understandably and fortunately, there is a stronger belief that creativity is something that can be learned. I think it would be very sad if, as a school principal, you do not have that belief. But in some countries, it's actually you get to 60% or maybe 70%. So in some countries, there's a fair share of school principals that are skeptical. So, they believe in this kind of destiny thing like students do. Now, but among students, you can clearly see that those numbers are lower, and that probably reflects their own experiences. Now, but I think it was interesting that in some education systems, also leaders in schools do not, share that view of a growth mindset that, as we know, is a very powerful predictor. And it's a concept, by the way, developed by one of the first Jedan laureates, Karl Dweck, that actually highlighted this. Now, so let's look at classroom practices. Now, what I also thought was really interesting is that students and school principals' views on their teachers' use of pedagogies for creative thinking. We asked the students, to what extent do you see those kinds of pedagogies in your classroom? And we asked the teachers or the school principals, to what extent do you encourage and enable those kinds of things? And the two pretty much align. So there seems to be students maybe have a good eye. Countries in which students, see those things happen more frequently are also the ones where school leaders actually pronounce that in stronger ways. So I think that's something that gives us courage, that perhaps we can make those kinds of pedagogies visible simply through the eyes of students on that. Now, on the curricular activities, just one chart here. We looked at the availability of activities offered at school, and you can see, art classes, painting, drawing, that's quite common. Music as well. Computer programming, drama, creative writing, science, debating, publications. They're sort of those activities that we all relate to creativity are perhaps less prevalent. Unfortunately, in all education systems, students from wealthier backgrounds have more opportunities. Now, that may, again, explain some of the social gap than students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, that's perhaps also not much of a surprise. perhaps, that's even the bigger distinction. Now, the fact that, in school everybody learns mathematics, but then what you add to that is more where parents have greater influence and where social background probably has much more of a role to play for this. No? Very last point I want to make is on digital environments and some truly surprising findings for us. Now, we looked at to what extent exposure to technology or how it relates to creative thinking skills. And what you can see here is where technology is used for learning at school. The curve goes up a little bit, and that's perhaps not so surprising. If you never use technology, probably you're kind of very isolated kind of community. But then you can see a kind of slowly downward sliding curve. So suggesting that technology intensity is probably not one of the great predictors of better creative skills, but also that curve is not so dramatic. No. When you use digital learning activities on weekends, that can add to your learning, and you can see actually that curve slopes upwards. But then also, when you see sort of more than 4 hours, you can see also that line goes downwards in a very clear way. The pattern becomes even more pronounced when you look at technology use for leisure. You use your own smartphone or computer, and you can see this line only goes downwards now, basically, and very steeply so. So you can, and we have data from volumes 1 and 2 that clearly show that is related to student distractions. Now, students talk about, I get distracted, I can no longer concentrate when I use my phone, or when my classmates use their phone, and so on. So there is lots of things going on, but you can see the same for creativity. And then, digital for leisure and weekends, that's probably, a different story. There you can do lots of interesting creative things that do not distract you from learning. But once again, we need to be aware of those kinds of relationships. We need to have a deeper understanding of them, what they mean. No? In fact, you can say that the negative impact that technology has for leisure at school is larger than the impact that we saw from school closures during the pandemic, which we have talked about a lot. But the pandemic is over, hopefully, but this actually is remaining with us. And I think getting schools to come to grips with this. How do we deal with this in a constructive way? You can ban smartphone, yeah, that's one solution, but can we do that in smarter ways, in more intelligent ways, that we use the power of technology to enhance learning while not having it get into the way? I think there's a lot that education policy needs to do, and it's not just for better academic outcomes. It's clearly also related to creative thinking, as you can see here. So, in a nutshell, what have you seen? First of all, academic excellence, is not a prerequisite to be creative. You could see, on these line charts that some students from lower levels do become quite creative thinkers, but you need a good baseline performance. If you do not master the foundations, you're going to have a hard time in creativity. It's not that, people who fail at school become super creative. Now, that's just very, very rarely happening. So now I think that's a very, very important message that we need to take away. Girls are much stronger creative thinkers than boys in most countries, very few exceptions to that pattern. And in part, that is explained by their attitudes, by the way they approach problems, by their greater capacity to take perspectives, by, by feeling more imaginative. They're open to perspective taking and so on. And together with curiosity, openness to intellect, and persistence, those are the best predictors that we have for creative thinking skills. And then last but not least, the impact of social background, something that education hasn't been dealing with very successfully, but the strength of that association is less pronounced than what we see in the disciplines, which again, should give us hope that we can address it. And that's really, I think, the findings from this report. It is really, I believe, one of the most interesting pieces that Pisa has developed, and I very much look forward to our discussions in this conference on what those results mean and what we can do with them to make education better. Thank you very much.
Andreas, thank you very much for that presentation, and congratulations on the results, the latest Pisa results. We have some questions from journalists in the Zoom, and we'll jump into those real quickly, being mindful of time as your meeting goes forward. Just to go into one that you dealt with at the end of the presentation is having to do with information and communication technology devices being used by students at home, but also in the classroom. What impact is that having on creative thinking? Do you see more of the challenges or more of the opportunities?
Well, I think the data show more of the challenges than the opportunities, but I still think that should not cloud our picture towards the opportunities. I do believe that the reason for this is we have, more of a consumptive use of technology than a creative use of technologies. And what we should see in school is probably more of, creative use of that than just, it's clear, technology can make learning more granular, more interesting, more experiential, but it can also make learning more scripted, more passive, more receptive. And again, I would also like, to re-emphasize the distinction. When we see technology used for learning, the line is pretty flat. It becomes a distraction when it's used for leisure in kind of, unstructured ways, social media and whatever. That is certainly not, something that, makes you more creative. No?
Okay, thank you very much. Another question, when we look at the diversity of results across countries, do we see a relationship between curriculum choice and creative thinking, or potentially between pedagogy and creative thinking?
Well, pedagogy, you could see that quite clearly. When you have students reporting certain kind of pedagogies, you can see, or a student believes about pedagogies, that they are predictors of better outcomes on creative thinking. So I think that is quite clear. On the curriculum, I think we have to analyze that in much greater depth, because on the surface, most curricula claim that they include creativity. I think the challenge really is not curriculum design, but curriculum implementation. How do those ideas in the curriculum translate into classroom practice? Now, if you want kids to be creative, you have to give them space to do things, to experiment. Now, if they experiment, they take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If our education systems are not really good in helping students learn from and with mistakes, maybe students do not become so creative. So I really think we need to look much harder into curriculum implementation than just in what's written in the curriculum.
One of the findings in the report, sure to get some attention, is the gender gap, where we're seeing girls outperforming boys in creative thinking. They're in the same classrooms, so what's going on exactly?
Yeah, I think this is one of the interesting points that we see, but at the same time, the report also provides many of the answers to this. What is quite clear is that the attitudes with which girls grow up are more conducive to creative thinking. You need to be open to new ideas, to different sides of an argument, be able to take perspectives. You need to have an intrinsic interest in creative thinking. And those are things that despite the fact of being in the same classroom, may develop in quite different ways. So I think again we should look at gender and creative thinking is the same seriousness as we have done in math and science. In math and science, we've done a lot about closing those gender gaps by understanding, how boys and girls learn math and science. And I think for creative thinking, we lack the tools, the eyes and ears to see that, but now we have them.
Something else that you may want to give us some insight on, particularly I would think from the questionnaire, is what role does the family play in creative thinking? How important is that compared to the classroom?
Well, it could be that one of the reasons why social background plays out in different ways is precisely the families. You could see how, the attitudes of parents and students correlate in ways. I think the environment that you provide to your children and the way you encourage them to think divergently, think creatively, the opportunities you provide in terms of, extracurricular activities, I think those things are very, very important. And I think that's true for education in general. I would go as far as, is saying that, for maybe the last decades, we've made the fundamental mistake of believing that schools can make up for what parents do not provide. And that clearly, hasn't worked anywhere in the world. Now, I think the bigger question really today is how can schools, get parents into the picture, make parents active contributors to education rather than trying to compensate for what doesn't come to parents, from parents, actually bring parents, into the picture. And education systems that are doing well on this assessment are very, very good at that. You know, parents do play an active role, and there is a very, very strong communication link between the school and the family. So I really think that's part of where we can act through policy. Yes, you know, families really matter a lot, and schools can probably do a lot more to actually make sure that we can build that into public policies.
Andreas, with that, I think we're going to close this press conference presentation of the PISA results. Thank you very much. Wishing you all a very fruitful continuation of your meeting.
Thank you.